Okay, we're back. We're back for our next presentation. This is a conversation with Dr. Tamar Boisian, who is a professor, writer, scholar. Dr. Boisian is a sound shaper. She loves thinking about the vibrations of beats through language and techno. Her work is experimental, visual, and intertextual, intercultural, queer, and explores themes around movement, subjectivity, symbols, and transmission. She's the author of It Is What It Is and Armenian Matriarchy. Perhaps more importantly, for the sake of this conversation about futures, she's currently the editor-in-chief for the journal Society of Armenian Studies and is deeply concerned with questions of Armenian Futurism. Now, as we did earlier today, I was intrigued when I was thinking about the questions of the vision of Afrofuturism, about the ways that Afrofuturism seems to be in dialogue with these many other futures. Just as I spoke with Vidhu Agarwal about the impact on Desi's Futurism and the links and connections that are articulated by a comparison of these two thought processes and these thought areas, I think Armenian Futurism is an important emerging conversation about future that is drawn very specifically from, I think, a legacy around a group that has experienced trauma, but is looking towards a different pathway. So I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk to Tamar about this. And I wanna say thanks, Tamar, for joining me here for this conversation. I know that this is something that's very near and dear to your heart. And so I just want to start out by saying thank you for joining us and say hello. I wish you were here in person, but we'll make this happen anyway. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah.
Okay, cool. And everyone can hear her, right? Okay, cool. So Tamar, I think one of the things that is really important about this work on Armenian Futurism that you're doing is that it's connected to a very complicated, already established scholarly community that's studying the sort of legacy and impact of our media, but it's also trying to do something that is really new in a sense that it's trying to look past a kind of established narrative about Armenia. And the first thing I want to ask you to do is sort of talk a little bit about what you think of as the current state of the question of Armenian studies and why Afrofuturism seems to resonate with what you're talking about when you say Armenian Futurism.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, and thanks to all the organizers. So like you mentioned, Armenian Futurism is actually a very new concept, but also a very old concept. So I just want to acknowledge that there was an Armenian Futurist movement in the early 20th century. And this started in the two literary centers of the Armenian diaspora. So in current-day Istanbul, known at the time as Constantinople, and in Tbilisi, or Tiflis, Georgia. And there's a great study that was done by contemporary poet of Western Armenian and writer and critical thinker Tamar Boyadjian called Hagagan Futurism or Armenian Futurism, which in a detailed way outlines the early movement of futurism in Armenians in the 20th century. So as you all know, the early movements of futurism were sometimes arguably fascist in nature, anarchist. And so in this period, the Armenians started translating, for example, like the Manifesto of Futurism, right, by Filippo Marinetti. And they sought to basically look at these older forms, and it was an actual complete rejection of anything Armenianist from its past, trying to create a new sense of an Armenianist in the age of modernity. So thinking about a nationalism of Armenianness that completely forgot the past centuries, even, for example, criticizing some of the greatest poets of the early modern or medieval period and saying that we are now the new poets, we're the new age of writing. And so attempting to create this vision of Armenians where a republic or an independent republic of Armenia could be formed. And there was a republic from 1918 to 1920 that was formed post-genocide. However, the issue that happened with the early movement of futurism was that in 1915, under the Ottoman Empire, 1.5 million Armenians were massacred and deported from their indigenous lands. And for example, here I could just speak to my own family history. So my family is from the Ottoman Empire, Anatolia, and my family was, my great-great-grandparents were in the death marches. They went through the Syrian desert and they settled in Beirut, Lebanon. So the genocide itself basically became this endpoint for the early vision of futurism of Armenians. And so this trauma, interestingly enough, is what the new wave of futurism is working to kind of heal from, right? So thinking about a futurism that is not handicapped or stuck in the trauma of its past, but can imagine itself and its people in a new way that can work through that trauma of genocide and reinvent itself in a healthier way through the use of literature, art, and poetry. I think two interesting things that early futurism for Armenians kind of offers us that becomes something that has thought about or has influenced the way in which the current movement of futurism is thinking about is the idea of language. So influenced by Russian futurism, there was this term called zaum, and it's translated sometimes like transmental or transreason. And it's this idea of the indefinite or the intermediate nature of language itself. This becomes really important with a language like Western Armenian, my native dialect, which is an endangered language. It's a language of diaspora that does not have a country in which the language is attached to. So I think this is something that I want to talk a little bit more later, or maybe through my writing, but the idea of language as a problematic representation, one, of experience, right, that becomes both an enabler and disabler of that experience is something that Armenians have, I think, always struggled with in their expression of literature and poetry. But another interesting thing came out in this early movement called the Oriental Futurism. And I think this also becomes a point of connection. And it's the idea that instead of looking to Western Europe as ways of influencing the notion of futurism or a future, it's to look indigenously, to look at your own people, its own culture, its own literary, artistic, musical endeavors, and to use that as a way of generating an idea of a future, right, that comes from your own past.
So one of the things that is sort of crucial to the definition of Afrofuturism is that its original origin narrative, which is articulated by Mark Derry in 1994, which he does so in the context of a conversation with three scholars, Samuel R. Delaney, a science fiction writer, Greg Tate, who just recently passed away, is a very important essayist and hip hop scholar, and Trisha Rose, who was a really sort of seminal hip hop scholar. And in the context of that interview, which is at some level asking a question that wasn't quite right, which is a question of why didn't African Americans engage with science fiction? But in the context of doing that, he coins the term Afrofuturism, and he points to, in essence, the experience of modernity on Black bodies in a coercive way that it expresses itself. And because of that, there's I think, an inherent connection between the question of trauma and the sort of transformative power of Afrofuturism. And you allude to this as well as like a key part of the origin point of the contemporary movement of Armenian Futurism, which I want to stress, and you alluded to, this is a new movement that I think draws something from the sort of current global conversation about Afrofuturism. And like other, our previous conversation when we were talking about Day's Futurism, there is a clear sort of diasporic conversation happening here connected to Armenians, Armenian identity, and the question of how Armenians fit within modernity, however, I think is perhaps even more cogent because at some level, they're the victims, that is Armenia, the Armenian identity is a victim of modernity in a very particular way. And so when you think about this idea of trying to create a new future, how do some of the tenets that I might associate with Afrofuturism, which is like a kind of Black feminist ideology, a kind of, different kind of aesthetic, you point to language as a space to do this. What are the spaces where the Armenian futurism that you're talking about is manifesting itself? And what is the sort of tools of kind of future practice are being forged.
Yeah, thank you. Right, as you say, it's really interesting because different artistic creators that are working or self-identify as futurists or Armenian futurists, they kind of define the futurism in different ways. I can speak to a general sense of it, but I also like to speak to how I kind of think of a futurism.
Sure.
So for me, it kind of goes back to the idea of trauma, as you say, a diaspora culture, right? So, which then as I mentioned, the language connected to a diaspora culture. But I don't really want to think about trauma without thinking about healing. And I think so a lot of the futurist artists are using the actual mode of their art as moments of healing. So for example, we have someone who's, let's say, like a sculptor, thinking about the moment of creating sculpture as the process of healing itself, right? So when I think about writing poetry or when I think about translating, I think about the moment of working within language as a self-healing and reflective process, but also one that I anticipate the reader or my future reader will heal through reading of the language itself. Now, this brings up a really interesting question with when you have endangered languages like Western Armenian. This is something I've thought about for a long time. So Western Armenian currently is on the UNESCO list of endangered languages with under 200,000 speakers worldwide. When I, as a poet, think about writing in Western Armenian, the conflict and like the conversation that becomes interesting to me, oh, I'm so sorry about my dogs, is with, for example, other indigenous writers or African writers that think about the choice that they have to make in language itself. So do I write in, for example, the language of the colonizer, or do I write in my indigenous language, right? And now there's movements toward arguing that Armenians were or can be considered and enter conversations of colonialism and post-colonial theory, thinking about being subjects of the Ottoman Empire and the way that's kind of affected the way in which the process of identity, self-reflection, and language has worked for Armenians in their own place in the empire and in self-expression. So it becomes an interesting notion to think about how language works, the problems of expression of language, and then what language to use, right? And so language then becomes tied to notions of loss that I think are very interesting in comparison to thinking about Afrofuturism, the loss of, for example, land itself or an indigenous land of which you're removed or displaced from, the loss of culture, right? The loss of language, the loss of perhaps identity. So those are some of the things that I think about too in my work, and current futurists are thinking about. How do you tie yourself to a land, or how do you imagine a land that, for example, your family has not been for generations, that you have a trouble creating now a genealogical link, but in your imagination or fantasy, it is of course your land, right? Where your grandparents have spoken of, where they tell stories, where there's cultural, experiences that are very much documented in an oral tradition. So poetry for me becomes interesting because I think about poetry as a deconstruction of sound. And you did mention that I'm also a techno DJ. So for me, like techno and poetry, and I self-identify as a concrete poet, or some would say visual poet, is very much about the deconstruction of sound. So I think about the places where language has become something that can promote or help me create an identity, but also in places where it takes away from my identity. And so thinking about a word or a sound and deconstructing it and rebuilding it becomes a metaphorical process of, for me, arguably a form of futurism, right? So if we go historically, for example, to the concrete poetry movement that came up, for example, in Brazil with the Noigandes group, or post-World War II Germany, it's about dealing with the trauma of your past, right? And so the concrete poetry is about where sound and image become integral parts of expression of your language. And so thinking about how we can take sound and image, deconstruct that, as a moment of healing, or metaphorically a process of healing, and then reconstruct it into perhaps a new language, a new sound, a decipherable word, an undecipherable word. But in that process, it itself creates the moment of healing and a kind of futuristic enterprise for re-examining a place where we can exist with the elements of our past, but with a prominent future for ourselves. So I was just going to quickly say something about techno. I mean, the history of techno too comes from communities. And I mean, I would like to also allude to, of course, house music, right? But being in Detroit, it's a really, I think, really significant thing to think about how techno and the history of techno, the playing of vinyls, the emergence of the movement with people like Juan Atkins and Derek May and Kevin Saunderson and my friend DJ Psycho, Desi Magby, like how they created moments where the 4/4 beat in techno becomes deconstructed and reconstructed. And I think about moments that are really beautiful where you take a vinyl and you give it to your friend and you're like, man, throw this in your set, right? And so that actual beat or creation of a beat by someone else that becomes interconnected or interwoven into the way that you're using the process of deconstructing and reconstructing the 4/4 beat as healing creates like a community where these kind of things get entangled and that the healing process becomes between different kinds of people, right? And then reemerges itself as a new form of sound.
Right, I really appreciate that. And I do want to talk to you more about just this idea, because of course, in Afrofuturism, the centrality of hip hop, the practice of the DJ is often cited as a prime example of a kind of hip hop practice. We tie that to African Americans, but of course that practice is also a global practice, whereby the sort of techniques associated with hip hop, the using the break, the creation of the new beat, the borrowing from and remixing, the hacking of the sort of sound system,
right,
creates is a kind of emblem of Afrofuturist practice. And you mentioned that as something that's happening with the language, right? That the language, and this comes through also in the conversations that a lot of visual artists have about their work, that their hope that in the creation of the images they're creating, they are in fact eliciting a different neural pathway, a different way of seeing through
right.
the creation of this art. And you seem to be talking very specifically about both an endangered language, Western Armenian, but also language itself as a way of encoding identity, encoding reality, encoding order, and seeking a way that uses that practice in a different way, a more liberatory way. And one way that we can sort of define Afrofuturism is the intersection between speculation and liberation, a definition that is wide, but I like to use it in part because it calls attention to the intentionality of the people who are doing it. And so for you, when you think about Armenian Futurism, where are the places that you have to go back and recover, because that's often an important part of Afrofuturism. It's the past, it's the present, it's the future, it's all happening at the same time. Where are the places that you have to go back to recover some of the culture that's in danger, and how does this play itself out? Because just as is the case with Futurism, I think there is some controversy represented by this push towards an Armenian Futurism, because trauma, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I sense that trauma has been very important to the intellectual framework of Armenian social political narratives. And you're pushing for, we have to look beyond this, which is a very classic Afrofuturism thing. Like we cannot be defined by trauma. That is one way I think Afrofuturism breaks from other, perhaps, intellectual movements associated in the last century for African Americans. So there's a question here about the past. What do you have to do there? And there's a question here about the present, navigating the challenges of the sort of political landscape. I think one of the things that has come through in some of the conversations we had about this is that, yes, you're looking at Afrofuturism and saying like, well, these people are doing it. They're moving past trauma. What are the terms that they're doing? And you're trying to translate that into your sphere. And of course, as the editor of the Journal of Note, I don't think that's not a abstraction. The journal, you're the editor of the Journal of Armenian Studies. So this is a big deal. So tell me a little bit about that path work, that recovery work that's important, but also this contemporary sort of politics that you're navigating.
Right, thank you. So I think the one difficulty for Armenians in healing from the trauma of our past and the genocide is that Turkey has still not yet recognized the Armenian genocide. So to think about the way they talk about trauma in the brain and how trauma works, trauma makes us stuck in a particular place, right? We see our vision of the world is always navigated through a lens of that trauma that until we heal from, we're kind of stuck in that moment. So first, I think it's about individually understanding or healing from the trauma. But of course, the validation of your experience is very important. So it's natural to look out and say, well, look, I had this experience, my family had this experience, and I would like you to accept what has happened so that I could move on. And I think what becomes challenging, and I think what a lot of my friends that are working in futurism or identify as Armenian futurists are thinking about is, how do I do that for myself when I might never get the validation from outside or my perpetrator that these crimes were committed, right, against me and my family. So the question here becomes the notion of witnessing, right? And Mark Nishanyan argues that the only witness to a trauma is the person who basically had experienced the trauma, but therefore that leaves no witnesses, right? So how do you, as a person who is the descendant of survivors, become a witness for someone who you really can't be a witness for, right? And oftentimes I think about language itself as a form of witnessing, right? So if I think about the endangered language of Western Armenian, and I think about writing in that language, I often wonder if I'm witnessing the moment of trauma simultaneously with being able to heal it by engaging in that language, right? But that language becomes an insular language for only speakers of that language. So what becomes interesting is, how do I engage with the people that have experienced the same trauma as I have by using my own language, but then how am I able to relay that experience to people who don't understand that very language? So for me, Armenians have very much been part of diaspora culture for a very, very long time, right? People could argue thousands of years. So language itself in its purity, I think, becomes also something that I push against. So a pure Western Armenian language is something that I actually don't imagine really exists. So in the diaspora culture, for example, of my family in Lebanon, right, Arabic, French, right, Lebanon was French, are very common insertions into the language, where if we know that language itself may not, or one particular language may not be able to express all of what we've experienced, I'm very comfortable, and in my work use multiple languages to express what I really think that moment, or what I'm really trying to convey as this moment of interconnection. Because to me, I think that community and interconnection and sharing are also very important parts of healing. So to be in dialogue with other cultures and other peoples that have experienced similar kinds of trauma, I think are healing for everyone, rather than thinking about, oh, well, this is mine and I need to kind of protect it in my own, and sharing it because it's so vulnerable, right? Becomes hard oftentimes because that vulnerability in the past has become something that has been detrimental, right? To the experience of Armenians. So there are criticisms of my work that think about the deconstruction of language as killing the pure language, deteriorating the language, that the language isn't spoken or thought of that way. And so these are some things that I really am open to having conversations with people about, as also a process of that very healing that we're trying to kind of experience and work through as Armenians.
I think that's a great answer to the question, and it points to like our previous conversation with Dr. Agarwal Vidu.
Yeah,
you're a scholar and also an artist. You're a poet, you're a writer, you're a creative, and your work actually sort of captures the kind of intellectual moment that you're thinking about and you're a part of. And so I'm going to transition over now to give you a chance to do some reading of your work, and then we'll have a Q&A. Again, I'll say this for the audience. If you're watching us on Zoom and you have a question for Tamar about her work or about the implications of thinking about Armenian futurism, make sure you drop it in the Q&A. But she is graciously sharing some of her poetry, some of her creative writing with us. And so I'm gonna turn it over to her, and I'll let you do it. So.
Okay, thanks. So I think I could share. I just wanted to put up the poetry for you all. Like I was saying, a lot of my stuff is visual, or they call visual or concrete poetry. So I wanted to share a few of that, and then a conceptual piece that I have written. Okay, I think I got, yes, okay. The other, the one that is not me and can never be, the bearded fortress of our perfect dreams for you. You is not. Yes, Incas Gunaim Hayalimet Hayaling Gobochen. I, only I see I through the opaque shadows of myself. The mystery is solved upon entry through the passageways of inflicted magistrates, infected, writing my story just like the valance of a window avails the light to no shade. Yes, Incas Kunai, Myelin Match, Incas Bochem. Why do you speak in your native tongue when my language offers all that is needed for you? When my language provides you a way to express all that I need of you? Why do you want your own when you have me move? Subject te, ve, te, ti. I am not the color of your skin. I do not see you, only that in you which is not me. I can tell all your stories, your dreams, your nightmares, because I am part of them. Who do you see when you look in the mirror? I change. Ink on na 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 na. Represent nation. Disfigured adaptations qualify lenses of reenactments. The lavender of the colored gave and play acting souls who convert the one who is one on who is not you. I hear you call through the window, widow, tempting ample tries of bloody apples trapped in the broken glass of the mirror. The metonym you, the poison and the cure to my amputated lantern of endless song, fueled only by the drug of my darkness. I see you through the mirror of the other, dispatched, dark, circle eyes, lashes, dripping, dropping, decorating, the tears shrouded the drape of my skin through. Thank you. Is it only in the gaze that we exist for each other? The simultaneous simulacrum demands a sacrifice, a witness to its horror, hallucinatory martyrdom. Forgive. The imposition now upon I, castrated tongue, singing spectacular, spectator, seeking solace. Eo, speculum, tears of empire. The violation of interdiction, the stranger learned, pardon me. The stranger learned the language of majesty, magister, and then forgot their own. This is two poems that I wrote for a very prominent and exciting Detroit-based magazine called Infinite Mile that unfortunately went out of production. But it's very much influenced by the city of Detroit and me feeling very much at home with the city when I moved to Detroit. And thinking about the idea of the loss of land itself, the city, and our place as we move or navigate ourselves in cities. It also made me think about how we describe cities, and it made me think about symbols of language that become metonymmic functions of the way we experience ourselves and our bodies. So Sid, your visage penetrates the streets as if they were, sorry, I'm so sorry about my dogs. Mm. Your visage penetrates the streets as if they were written pages. The city says everything in her gaze, everything you conjure, you mirror in her discourse. Through your canter, coated arms and yearning calls, music condensing the sound, recording, pulsating through concealed shrines, dead branches of the past housed in bloody brick valances, petals of perpetual falls, repeating, relaying, sorrowful stones, weeping, laughter of misunderstanding. Arriving to the city and ignorant of the language, you draw from gestures delivered in symbolic dreams, a quiver, a bow and arrow. Replace objects in your city bag. Repeat, same scene, change actors. And when you live the city, the one you accept as necessity, the one imagined to others, a moment later, the impossible city imagined and performed only in yourself. You describe her in a dialogue of deletions, mirrored voices, recalling relics, reconstructed parables, paralyzing your perception of her. You know better than to confuse a city with the words that describe her. Repeat, same scene, change words. A wordless inscription silenced the city through language. Repeat, same scene, fatal decline. That place in my mind is that space that you call mine without hearing what I have to say. Repeat, same scene, no dialogue. So this actually is from old carvings of Armenian inscriptions from before the Common Era. So I found these in a manuscript, and I was thinking about how we might interpret symbols. And one thing I'm really interested in my work is thinking about actual letters. So we kind of take the Noigandis group when they wrote their manifesto of concrete poetry. They were talking about how words have become empty coffins. And what they meant by that is that when we think about the nature of a sound that comprises a word and then the actual word itself, language or the actual letters are really calligraphic symbols where we assign meaning. And if all of us that assign the same meaning to that language enables us to communicate in that language, right? And this is kind of the basis for Western European semiotic theory and the way they think about language itself. So I was thinking about what would happen if we changed the symbols of language, or that these are really symbols that we could actually attribute kind of our own meaning onto. So this is something that I kind of tried to play with. So there was a scholar who had created like a key of those symbols, of these symbols. And so one of the experiments that I did was looking at this key and thinking about what kind of meaning comes out when we interpret or assign this key of their own archaeological and anthropological study to this Armenian symbolic language. So this was the series of symbols, and then this would be the translation in Armenian. And so I aligned those symbols with the words that came up. So the component arachin in the first ideogram is resolvable into fire above man, the new beginning and perspective on the city. The picture is abbreviated to the light and the moving legs that are walking. It is the upper part of the fire sign, which might have been started by the goddess of light moving below the horizon of the city. Ancient city lamentations speak of the fall of the city when the protective goddess abandons the space which she is inhabiting. Zork also applies to the third ideogram, which indicates the mountainous army protector who moves away from the city, leaving the inhabitants, her son, as a cursed slave. We find nature as steel and oil, like a corpse, a sign I find only in compound words, a wounded body. But the temples remain as trees, a vulgar form of the sign, or perhaps an abbreviation of the full flock, reviving the music of the goddess who once sang her praise for her city. Paraphrase. First, that master ruling mountain range, son, a slave of that cursed godly steel, the journey to become a large temple, tree, left palm of the river turns into oil. Loss in interaction being apparent on the study of the ideograms, their interrelation, and the repetition or echo of components, not only those used, but those suggested or avoided. Have you not understood the inscriptions, the city, until you see the tremendous antithesis between man and nature? Line 1, number 3, number 5, line 2, number 5, number 3, number 5, line 4, number 3, number 5. The visual is not enough to comprehend. You are not finished. Just as in the city, you must confront in yourself an ever-present dimension lost. We insist on seeing and reading, but what is forgotten remains in the silent light between the ideograms of the city. We assign the letters to make it palatable, yet we refuse to enter the dangerous, forbidden districts. The foreigners are breathtaking in their otherness, but when we do not know the meaning of the gaze, we simply choose not to look. This is entitled Silent Word City. Duh. He is not only an interpreter of the play of dissimulation who can be likened to one who exposes letters, he or it is also in the place of what is called here being or the letter. This is a quote from Derrida's The Gift of Death. We are constantly asked to think about the way in which technology can build a future, but we have forgotten that once writing was considered to be technological, and more importantly, that systems of writing are forms of visual art. But today I take for granted the graphic expansion of the word, or that the word, the letter, is in and of itself a symbol of power. And I substitute the essence behind word, letter, phrase, a meaning imposed on me through language itself, a hegemonic language that relies on that same system that once was considered artistic and revolutionary. You know what I'm trying to reify through these blank verbal constructs. Here I wander through the language of the city, the spoken and the unspoken, the technological and graphic, the grid of the building blocks that simultaneously form and deform. For is not naming unnaming? Does it not depend on whose name we, you are using? Does it not rely on the language you are naming me with? I am forced to speak through you, your language. Do you even hear me? Since when I speak on my own, you pretend you don't understand me. Sometimes because of you, I can't even understand myself anymore. What is the language of my city whose light shines through my calligraphic infrastructures, isolating me? The incest of imposition has made me mute. I can only methodologically copy your script now. Seems it will always remain in your hand. I try to relive it by cutting it off. It may rehabilitate itself anew through the curvatures drawn with my conduit pen. How do you read the silent light between the letters of the city? Luis sus lam lumière du monde. Nur al nur al nur Eleanor hell licht lecht erhellen phos photos lumen limen luce luce lapsus uvallo vallo vile. I do not speak as I have spoken, that paralyzing, uncontended truth, a prosthetic linguistics. Sorry. Into submissive oblivion. I do not hear as I have been heard, that city of unmasquerading truth unveiled, a silent madness prevails wise into uncontrolled absent crescent rules. And that pretty much goes through the whole page, the sound of this is actually, this last piece is a conceptual piece that I wrote. And it is based on 4 medieval Armenian lamentations. Lamentations are, of course, elegies written for the loss of something. They could be gods, people, but these are written for the loss of cities by 4 Armenian, medieval Armenian ecclesiastical figures, actually. So the first is the lament for the destruction of my Eastern home. So what I did in this conceptual piece is I took these 4 laments, which are called Hazar Doghani, so thousands of lines, they're poems, and I extracted from each of the laments the object of the word lament within the poem. So when the word vohbam or lament appears in the poem, whatever this object is of the lamentation or what is being lamented, I extracted and I created a visual piece out of each of these 4 poems. So the first, in classical Armenian and Middle Armenian, for those of you obviously that are familiar with case languages, the accusative object is marked by this letter Z or the sound Z. So I basically extracted all the words that also started with Z as the poem's object. And then I created an image out of all these words from each of the poems. So the first is a lament on the destruction of my Eastern home by Khachadur Getsaretsi, written after the destruction of the invading armies of Mongol Ghazan Khan in 1298-1299. So Khachadur Getsaretsi's Vokhvasan Arev Mandasan Arevelian. The loss of the Eastern lands. Lament for the destruction of the Holy Cathedral of Echmiadzin by Stepanos Orbelian, similarly destroyed during the Mongol invasions of 1299. Lament for Edessa by Nerses Shonorali, one of the most praised Armenian poets in all of history, following the capture of the city by Nur al-Din Zengi in 1144. And a lament for Jerusalem written by the High Patriarch Curator, following the capture of Jerusalem by Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayub, known as Salah ad-Din, in 1187. Each piece below begins with the word vochbam, I lament, followed by all the accusative objects of the verb vochbam, to lament or lament. In classical Armenian, as in Middle Armenian, the accusative case is almost always preceded with the letter z. Each of the works below is built entirely on words found in the accusative case, extracted from each of the lamentations named above. So lament I is a lamentation, a sermon and a covenant to language and genre. Using the original words and letters chosen by these Armenian authors, these works lament that which our writers lamented of the past, a land now forgotten, trampled, torn, a memory to those who inhabited these parts, and a testament for those of us who can no longer call it our own. Lament I is the accusative object of that very loss, a witness of our trauma inscribed to the memory of an ancient pen, but only in cuneiform for the modern Armenian speaker, indecipherable. So this is the first one, the first lamentation based on Khachadur Getsaretsi. And I will read a little bit so you could kind of get the language, but Voch Khachadur Getsaretsi, Vochbam Zeis, as Kachzer, as Yergiris, as Myris, as Mer, as Kavarn, Zain, Zorpen, as Jaman, as Zain, Zart, Zorti, as Kach, as Zarigan, as Hoviv, as Hair, as Ask, as Askinas, as Giragin, as Zairin, as Tun Khachetzin, as Antan, as Sarsaij, Zinch, as Mair, as Kahanaik, as Acheret, as Yegeretzikt, as Kahanaik, as Chutlu Purain, as Yur, as Arkain, as Vratzi, as Temedrei, as Baron, Zur, as Mus, as Havadarim, Zorn, Zain, as Manatsort, as Ganonagan, as Yegeretziats, as Stepanos, as Vorti, as Christosi, as Pazma Charchar, as Avazanin, as Yergurali, as Ishchanas, as Ari, as Dars Saij, as Mej, as Tak, as Ator Uchts, Ail An. This is the second lamentation. This is the third. Which continues. To lament, I lament. This is the lament over Jerusalem by Curator. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Let's give Tamar a round of applause.
Thank you.
All right, sorry, you caught me off guard. I didn't know if you had another lament, but
well, I mean, we're always lamenting, I guess. Yeah, I do have a slideshow.
All academic lament. Sorry. All right.
I wanted to play this also, this slideshow, maybe during the Q&A. You could see some of the Armenian work too, because I read a lot of my English work, if that's okay. I mean,
yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay.
You want to show it while we're handling questions? Okay.
Sure.
Right. Okay. So I want to make sure that we give a chance to fill in questions for Tamar. If you're watching online, you have some questions. There is one question. Oh, we have some questions in here. Okay, so we'll start inside and then we'll make our way to any questions online.
Hi, hello, my name is
Hi.
Antonio. Thank you. This discussion is fascinating. I wanted to ask a question about something you mentioned towards the beginning about Western Armenian being a language that is endangered and does not have a nation to which it is attached.
Yes.
And I wanted to get more of your thoughts on what role having that sort of institutional attachment means for like the establishment of futurism. I guess when you said that, what I thought about was, for example, Israel established in like the late 40s, where suddenly they had like a series of institutions, education, government, and different things with which they could, you know, attach Hebrew as the language and kind of protect it in a way where, you know, they can create a hegemony and it's there. And so that's kind of what crossed my mind. So I wanted to ask you, you know, what role do you think having that sort of institutional protection of like a nation would matter towards the establishment of a futurism for a people doing that? And that's part one of my question.
Well, it's a very complicated question, I think, for Armenian. So the political history of Armenians and the Armenians of Anatolia and the Armenians of the Republic of Armenia can be studied together, but also are very separate histories. So when we say that Armenian doesn't have a republic or a language, that's not true, because the Republic of Armenia speaks Armenian and they speak the dialect of Eastern Armenian. And some people would argue that actually it's a completely different language than Western Armenian. The language itself has become a point of division among Armenians. So I think that makes the idea of futurism for Armenians a little bit difficult, because some may say that the futurism that people in the Republic of Armenia imagine is quite different than the futurism that a diasporan Armenian would imagine. So for a diasporan Armenian speaking, I'm so sorry. For a diasporan Armenian speaking Western Armenian, sorry. The idea of not having a country, for example, is very much tied to the idea of trauma, right? Because it is very much an indication that the language itself and the displacement of its people, right, were not attached to a central unit that could hold the people and the language together. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think for me, it also becomes a nostalgia of where we were or where our family was and going back to those lands, right? So I think that becomes another question of thinking about how do we imagine a place of healing and a future when we are still thinking about our ancestors and our lands, right? That a lot of times romanticize that we will get those lands back, or we can go back to that homeland, right? Or things like that. And I mean, here, I think I should acknowledge the war that happened in the fall of 2020 with Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh, and how that very, very much brought into questions of indigeneity, the people on that land, and what it meant to be displaced, and oftentimes read as an extension of the genocide. So the invasion of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, the invasion of the Azerbaijan and Turkey, taking of the lands, the churches, it became a way in which we saw that as an extension of the genocide that's continuing into the generation today. Yeah.
Interesting. So then, like, am I to understand, based on your viewpoint, do you feel that sort of romanticization or lamentation of what that would represent is maybe obstructive, or maybe there is a role for it in sort of like the global formation of the idea of futurism for the whole group?
Well, I think that's a very difficult political question that I think Armenians would answer in different ways. I think it's something that's a point of contention between many Armenians. And I think it's something that needs to be answered for Armenians to move forward and heal in the context of futurism. I think that would be my answer. Yeah.
Okay. For those people who are online, looks like we might have an online question.
Yes, we have a question in the chat from Rachel Goshgarian. So how can we understand the relationship between Armenian futurism and Armenian history? Is Armenian futurism a means by which we can reimagine the past, or is it a means by which we can process the past, or is it something else altogether?
Thank you, Rachel. So this actually gives me the opportunity to acknowledge Dr. Rachel Goshkarian, who is the co-editor of the Journal of the Society of Armenian Studies. And I would like to say that we have a dedicated volume in 1 year to Armenian futurism. It is going to be the first thing that we have a collection of in print around the question of Armenian futurism. Julian will be contributing as well for Afrofuturism. And the part of the goal of this volume is to think about how we might define an Armenian futurism, and then bring that into conversation with other forms of futurism or other futurisms. And so Julian has graciously agreed to contribute on Afrofuturism and its connection with Armenian futurism as we create dialogues around futurisms and different kinds of cultures. So to your question, Rachel, and this is something that I think you and I have talked a lot about. So can we understand the relationship between Armenian futurism and Armenian history? And I'm actually curious to see, as a historian, how you would answer that. But I think that we most certainly can, because very much, in our discussion, and as Julian mentioned, thinking about our past becomes kind of an integral part of thinking about the future, right? But is Armenian futurism a means by which we can reimagine the past? I really like that point, actually. And that's something I think that I would like to think more about. Because is futurism a way to reimagine a past? Because if we think about trauma and the way that we kind of channel trauma through our brain or through our experiences, then it's thinking about a futurism, a healing process and way that we could rethink the past, where we can acknowledge that a trauma has existed, but then we could gain awareness and reprocess the trauma in a way that is healing and not destabilizing. So I think that's a really interesting way of asking that question. So to think as a future, and then the way the future helps us think about the past. And I think for Armenians, that could be a very healthy process. So yeah, reimagine the past, process the past. I think it's a way to understand the past too. I wanna acknowledge this writer, C.A. Conrad, and I went to a reading of theirs where they said something really beautiful and like heart-wrenching, but they mentioned that how their parents were factory workers. And so they mentioned how when they spoke to their parents, they could never really talked about the present. They always talked about the past or an imagined future, because thinking about the present, working in a factory would mean that you would have to acknowledge where you are in the present, and you have to think about perhaps yourself as an extension of a machine, right? And I think that in the connection to Armenians and the way we've tried to process the past and the future, the present also becomes something that's avoided. And so I was kind of mentioning this earlier to you, Julian, that I would want to think more about the present and the creation of art and writing in the present. And then as authorship theory talks about, or reading, the reader as a person who lives in the moment of the present as they're reading, as a form of healing, right? So not to avoid the present, because the present becomes also a place of healing. So when we're always kind of stuck in the past or the future, we forget about what is happening now, and how that moment and the now is very much an important part of the process of healing and process of looking at the future and looking at the past, right? So yeah, thank you for the question, Rachel. That was a really good question. Thank you.
I think one of the questions that occurs to me about your ongoing project around Armenian Futurism is the question of gender.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you've alluded to in some of your writing about the importance of the sort of foremother, the matriarch, again, at some level, the recontextualization of modernity away from the kind of binaries around patriarchy,
Right.
that are so central. So can you talk a little bit about that and how that intersects with language? Because I feel like one way that this plays itself out again is in how language constructs identity and constructs space.
Yes.
So that
yes.
some spaces are masculine, some spaces are feminine. And that becomes like, again, a kind of signifier order.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, thank you for this question, actually. So, the way that I see my work connecting with Afrofuturism is thinking about like the role of the woman, right, in the notion of futurism or the future. And this new project I have, which is tentatively titled Armenian Matriarchy, thinks about reimagining the line of Armenian literary history through the figure of the woman or the woman writer. So I went to Armenian school. I did Armenian history, Armenian literature, and we start from the beginning of, Armenian, the first Armenian written word, all the way through, focusing primarily on 19th century poets and writers who were victims of the genocide, but mostly male authors. And so I started thinking about, well, I can't trace my genealogy. I can't identify who my great-grandmother was, right? But then I started reading these Armenian authors of the 19th century, one of whom is Zabel Yesayan, who survived the Armenian genocide. She was one of the only few women, they're not really sure, but on April 24, when the Armenian intellectuals were collected to be massacred, they say that she was one of the only few women that was actually on the blacklist. And she escaped. She actually, for 3 months, was basically hidden by women in a maternity hospital, in a women's hospital. And her first novel that she writes in Paris after she escapes is called In the Waiting Room, which I am almost done translating, actually. And it's about the role of women, and it's about women in Paris who can't breastfeed their children. So they have to come to the maternité and get breast milk every day in order to feed their children. So I was thinking about how, because I can't identify like a great-great-grandmother, I was thinking about how much Zabel's work or Haiganush Mark or some of these other women writers that actually I wasn't exposed to as a child when I was taking Armenian literature, how much they really speak to my experience, and how, back to kind of Rachel's question, looking at the past of Armenian women writers is actually enabling me to think about an Armenian futurism of healing. So the one interesting thing that happens at the end of this novel that I think becomes a place where women become the healers or kind of the hope for this community is that there's a moment where she almost like gets this male doctor to understand what it would be like for a woman who can't feed her own child, right? Who can't provide the nourishment for her baby to live on and to basically to live, right? And thinking about a culture that has experienced genocide, the idea of genealogy, the idea of children, the idea of continuing life is very important. So I saw that, I was like, wow. So when I think about the male writers that I've been reading as a child and the experience that I was introduced to with the trauma of the genocide, I found that there was like a lack of hope almost, because if I think about their biography, like their fate was actually that they were massacred. But then when I think about the women writers and I think about how they talk about hope, they were the ones who cared for the community. They were the ones who cared for the children. I know that my grandfather, the way that he survived the genocide was that another family took him in, and he doesn't really know how he ended up in Beirut, but basically he survived the death marches as a baby. So it made me rethink how the role of women as healers, right, can become ways in which we could think about the hopefulness of a future, and the way that we could re-examine the past through the point of view of women writers as a way of helping us to heal and think about a futurism of Armenian that can go beyond the trauma of the genocide.
Oh, thank you for that. We're right at time, and so we're gonna take a little break. This is different from our previous breaks, though, because we're only gonna break for about 15 minutes. But before we do that, I wanna ask everyone to give Tamar another round of applause.
Thank you so much, thank you.
I really appreciate you taking the time to have, again, one of these very strange conversations about the ways that Afrofuturism and other kind of futures are in dialogue. I think we learned a lot, and I really appreciate you sharing your work and your perspectives on this sort of vital conversation that's shaping the field that you're in. I'm happy that we have a chance to sort of think about the ways that the frameworks of Afrofuturism are reflected in dialogue with some of the other questions about modernity and identity across the globe. We're going to pause here. As I said, we're only going to be doing this for 15 minutes. Then we're going to come back and have a conversation about teaching and learning around these questions that Tamar is going to participate in, Badu Agarwal, and hopefully Kiana Witt is going to be there. And we're going to talk a little bit about the consequences of trying to teach and learn about these things in a way that I think is very important. So take a moment, dash to the little boys, little girls room, and come back. But we'll be back for a nice little round table about teaching and learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you.